picking up from our previous discussion on the primacy of reasoning in moral decision-making, we now delve into a fascinating contrast: the interplay between our rapid gut-driven intuitions and the slower, deliberate process of conscious reasoning. This dynamic plays out dramatically in two distinct scenarios, as highlighted by Joshua Green's work in Moral Tribes. First, consider the classic tragedy of the commons. Imagine a shared pasture where every shepherd benefits from adding more sheep, but everyone suffers if the pasture is overgrazed. Cooperation here is about resisting selfish temptation for the collective good. It's fundamentally a me versus us problem. But then Green introduces a second, perhaps more dangerous tragedy. Imagine two groups of shepherds, each with their own deeply held beliefs about how the pasture should be managed. One sees it as a commons, the other insists on private parcels with fences. This isn't just disagreement, it's a clash of moral frameworks. Each side convinced their way is not just better, but right. This us versus them dynamic, fueled by rationalized intuitions and identity, is what drives most intergroup conflicts. What makes this us versus them conflict so perilous, according to Green? It's the way each group constructs its right. He dissects this brilliantly. Often, what passes for righteousness is really a powerful cocktail, a core, shapeless intuition favoring your group, slathered in layers of post hoc justifications. Think Hyde's intuition-first approach, amplified by respected figures championing the cause, and topped off with a sincere, almost pained conviction that the very essence of who they are and what they value hangs in the balance. The result? A belief so strong, so deeply felt, that individuals can no longer see the right for what it often is, a gut feeling dressed up in the robes of universal truth. As Oscar Wilde supposedly put it, morality is simply the attitude we adopt towards people whom we personally dislike. While cynical, it captures the kernel of Green's point. Many of our fiercest conflicts boil down to cultural disagreements about whose deeply ingrained, intuitively driven right is truly correct. It's the tragedy of common-sense morality, the idea that our seemingly common-sense morality is actually just one tribe's perspective. Let's make this less abstract. Imagine trying to illustrate cultural relativism. You decide to show images of something deeply disturbing in one culture, but perhaps normal in another, say a dog meat market in Southeast Asia. You search Google Images, expecting to find some pictures, maybe cringe a bit. Instead, you get hooked. Hours fly by. You're transfixed, torturing yourself with graphic after graphic. Dogs being carted off, butchered, cooked, sold indifferently. You project their fear, their thirst, their pain. You think, what if these were my dogs? What if this happened to a dog my child loved? Your heart races, and suddenly you feel intense hatred, visceral contempt for those people, for their entire culture. It takes immense effort, like a locomotive pulling against you, to admit that this hatred is baseless, purely intuitive, and that you couldn't possibly justify it rationally. You realize that the same reaction could have been yours had you been born in their place. That's the raw, painful power of the tragedy of common-sense morality, the certainty that they are deeply wrong, even when you can't logically explain why. So, what's the takeaway here? Our culturally infused institutions, religion, national pride, team loyalty, they play a double-edged sword. On one hand, when facing the classic me versus us dilemma, like the shepherd worrying about the commons, these very institutions can push us towards our better selves. They foster cooperation, help us resist the urge to be the lone free rider. They provide the social glue needed to solve the tragedy of the commons. But flip the script to the us versus them scenario, and suddenly those same institutions become accelerants for our worst behaviors. They harden our hearts, justify our biases, and propel us towards prejudice and conflict. It's a stark reminder of how context utterly transforms the function of our deeply held values. Now let's bring in the dual process framework. How does this play out in the me versus us scenario? Consider a study by Green, Rand, and colleagues using a public goods game, basically, a lab version of the commons tragedy. Participants decided how much money to contribute to a shared pot versus keep for themselves. The key finding was striking. When participants were given less time to decide, they contributed more. Faster decisions meant less room for calculating greed. Similarly, if you prime people to trust their intuition, maybe, by recalling a time intuition led them right, they were more cooperative. Conversely, if you told them to carefully consider their options or valued reflection, they became significantly more selfish. Why? Because careful thought allows for that classic calculated greed. Yes, cooperation is generally good, but given the circumstances, I should be exempt this time. It suggests that for within-group cooperation, our rapid shared intuitions are actually beneficial, and sometimes trying to consciously regulate that prosociality can backfire, as Bowles pointed out. Okay, so intuition is great for getting along within our group. But what happens when the game involves someone from outside our group, someone we perceive as them? While this hasn't been directly studied in this exact setup, the prediction is almost certainly intuitive selfishness. Think about it. Fast gut reactions when encountering someone perceived as different often trigger xenophobia, distrust, the them alarm bells. So for us versus them moral dilemmas, the advice flips completely. Keep those quick judgments at bay. Instead, engage in deliberate thinking, reasoning, questioning. Be pragmatic, almost utilitarian in your approach. Crucially, try to actively take their perspective, understand their thoughts, their feelings. It's a cognitive workout, demanding conscious effort, and you might need to do it multiple times, taking a breath, reassessing, before you can make a reasoned, rather than reactive, decision. It's about consciously overriding the default us versus them intuition. Let's shift gears slightly to the nature of truth and deception. Consider this scene: a tense question, a pause, and a calm, steady lie. No, absolutely not. Was that good or bad? Well, it depends entirely on the question. Ask a prosecutor, were you aware numbers were manipulated? And that lie is terrible. Ask Grandma, is this a toy you already have? And it's a perfectly understandable, even kind lie. Ask a doctor, is it fatal? And it's awful. Ask someone about an outfit, does this make me look? And it's social nicety. Ask about brownies, vent for later, did you eat the brownies? And it's a helpful lie. Ask about harboring a runaway slave, are you harboring Jack? And it's horrific, see the pattern? The exact same behavior, lying, can be morally bankrupt or virtuous depending solely on the context. It highlights how context defines meaning. And it's not just lying. Sometimes telling the truth, especially an unpleasant one, is also hard work for the brain, activating regions like the medial PFC and insula. Given this context dependency, it's no surprise that the biology of honesty and duplicity is complex. Evolution, in its relentless way, favors both deception and the ability to detect it. We even see precursors in simple organisms like social yeast. Dogs try to deceive rivals by masking their fear pheromones. Putting their tail between their legs is like saying, I'm not scared. Primates take this to another level. Capuchin monkeys will give false predator alarms to steal food from higher-ranking individuals. Gelada baboons will withhold mating calls if the female involved snuck away from her usual partner. And political chimps, they engage in sophisticated deception requiring serious social savvy. The bigger the neocortex, the more complex the lies. But crucially, while impressive, these animals likely aren't consciously strategizing, feeling guilty, or believing their own fibs. That complexity belongs to humans. Human deception is indeed on a whole other scale. We have incredibly fine control over our facial muscles. No other species can truly be poker-faced. We have language, allowing us to manipulate meaning itself. And perhaps most uniquely, we can finesse the truth. A fascinating study illustrates this. Subjects rolled a die privately for cash rewards, creating a clear incentive to cheat. Sure enough, there was cheating, and interestingly, rates correlated with national levels of corruption. Environment matters. But the pattern of lying was revealing. People didn't just report the highest possible number. They rolled twice and reported the higher of the two. Think about the rationalization. Oh darn, first rolls was a 1, second was a 4. Rolls are random, it could have been a 4. Let's just say I rolled a 4. It's a way to lie that feels less dishonest, less malodorous. It shows how our cognitive abilities allow us to bend the truth, often accompanied by self-serving justifications. So what happens in the brain when we lie? Naturally, theory of mind networks are involved, especially when deception is strategic. But a key player is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The DLPFC is famous for helping us do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. So, when we lie, does the DLPFC activate because we're struggling to resist the temptation to lie, the morally right thing? Or does it activate because we're trying to execute the lie effectively once we've decided to lie, the strategically right thing? It turns out both. The DLPFC seems to be involved in both the struggle against temptation and the executive effort required to carry out the deception effectively. It's like the brain's control center for both. Don't do it. And if you're going to do it right. This confusion about the DLPFC's role is evident in studies of compulsive liars. You'd predicted that people who constantly fail to resist lying might have weaker frontal control circuits, perhaps less gray matter. And people who are skilled liars, who do it habitually and well, might have stronger circuits, maybe more white matter connections. And guess what? Studies show exactly that. Compulsive liars tend to have increased white matter but decreased gray matter in the frontal cortex. Of course, correlation isn't causation, but it suggests a link. To untangle things further, researchers use tasks where people are instructed to lie or tell the truth. Here, the DLPFC consistently lights up, along with the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, the ACC activation isn't about moral conflict, because the subjects were told to lie. It's about cognitive conflict, the slight delay you feel when you know the truth but have to say something else. Reality versus claim creates a mental snag that the ACC monitors. This ACC-related delay is actually useful for polygraphs. The old-style measuring anxiety is notoriously unreliable. Anxious truth-tellers, unflappable sociopaths, and countermeasures defeat it. Modern polygraphs try to detect that subtle ACC-driven delay, the physiological sign of that cognitive conflict between reality and the lie. Better, but still imperfect. How do we get closer to causality? Enter transcranial direct current stimulation (TDCS). By temporarily disrupting the DLPFC during instructed lying tasks, researchers found that subjects became slower and less effective at lying. This strongly suggests the DLPFC is causally involved in successful deception. But it's complicated. Damage to the DLPFC actually makes people less likely to consider honesty in economic games. They become less self-controlled, less resistant to lying. So this cognitive hub is crucial for both resisting and executing deception. Okay, let's move beyond instructed lying to spontaneous cheating. Baumgartner and Fair looked at this in a trust game. Players made promises about how they'd play, always cooperate, sometimes never. Some broke their promises. When they did, their brain showed activity in the expected trio, DLPFC executing the lie, ACC cognitive conflict, and the amygdala emotional response may be guilt. Interestingly, patterns before the decision predicted breaking the promise. Along with ACC activation, the insula lit up. What does this mean? Is the cheater thinking, "Oh, I'm disgusted with myself for breaking my word"? Or is it more like, "I don't like this guy, he's kind of disgusting, so I owe him nothing"? Given our tendency to rationalize our own actions, the latter interpretation seems more plausible. The insula might be reflecting disgust directed at the other person, facilitating the betrayal. Green and Paxton took a different approach with their coin toss study. Participants guessed coin tosses for money, but occasionally, they could cheat by reporting a guess after seeing the outcome. Crucially, this was detectable. Honest guessing hovered around 50% accuracy. About a third of participants appeared to be major cheaters, another sixth borderline. When they cheated, the DLPFC was active, unsurprisingly. But here's the kicker. There was no significant ACC lag, no insula activation during the cheating act itself. It suggests that for these individuals, cheating wasn't particularly conflicted or difficult. The real struggle, the neurobiological Sturm und Drang, happened when they resisted cheating. During resistance, the DLPFC and ventrolateral PFC worked harder. The ACC was firing intensely, and response times were significantly delayed. For those capable of cheating, resisting temptation seems to be the real cognitive battle. This leads us to the most profound finding in this section. What about the people who never cheated? Were they constantly battling temptation, relying on a superpowered DLPFC to suppress the urge? Or was it effortless like breathing? Green and Paxton's data pointed towards grace. In the subjects who remained perfectly honest throughout, when the opportunity to cheat arose, the DLPFC, VLPFC, and ACC were practically dormant. There was no sign of conflict, no sign of effort. It wasn't a constant struggle, it was simply not done. Honesty had become implicit, automatic, like walking upstairs or remembering the days of the week. It suggests that for some, the relevant moral imperatives have been so thoroughly internalized, hammered into them through experience and consistency, that doing the right thing has become a near reflex. Now, does this mean impeccable honesty can only arise from automaticity? Not necessarily. We can certainly use cognitive control to resist temptation, especially in isolated instances. But in situations like Green and Paxton's, where the temptation repeats rapidly, successful resistance probably requires that automaticity. Think about heroism. When asked what they were thinking when running into a burning building, heroes often say, "I wasn't thinking. Before I knew it, I was in." It wasn't a calculation of risks and rewards. Emerson captured it. Heroism feels and never reasons. It's similar with perfect honesty. When asked why they never cheat, the answer might be, I don't know, I just don't cheat. It's not a cold calculation of consequences or adherence to rules. It's more like virtue ethics kicking in. That's not who I am. Doing the right thing becomes the path of least resistance, the easier option. Alright, let's pivot to the flip side of the coin, empathy. What happens when we see someone else in pain, fear, or sadness, and we ourselves experience something remarkable, a shared aversive state? We call this empathy, though it exists on a spectrum, even in babies and other animals. It's not monolithic, it has different forms, different underlying brain mechanisms involving sensory, motor, emotional, and cognitive elements. Various factors can sharpen or dull our empathic responses. But the big questions driving this chapter are, when does this empathic feeling translate into actual helpful action? And when we do act, whose benefit are we primarily serving, theirs or our own? Before diving deeper, let's quickly navigate the terminology jungle. We talk about empathy, sympathy, compassion, mimicry, emotional contagion, perspective taking, concern, pity. It's easy to get lost. There are distinctions based on power dynamics. Pity often implies a judgment of low competence, while sympathy is feeling for someone without necessarily feeling obligated to help. There's also a difference between just feeling sorry for someone versus truly understanding their situation, which involves empathy's cognitive component. Then there's the intensity and distance. Feeling for someone emotionally distant, feeling as if their pain is your own vicariously, or engaging in more detached perspective taking. And finally, compassion is when that resonance translates into action. The crucial point is that these states are generally internal, genuine feelings. You can't force someone to empathize, though you can certainly try to induce superficial compliance. Where do these empathic capacities come from? Looking at other species reveals primitive building blocks. We have mimicry, fundamental for learning, like young chimps watching mom use tools. Humans ironically over-imitate sometimes. Then there's emotional contagion, the automatic spread of emotions, like babies crying together or crowds surging into riots. Baboons forgetting a tasty gazelle chase because a rival is nearby is a dark example. More sophisticatedly, animals can learn fear vicariously. Mice exposed to another mouse's stress show lasting effects themselves. And Mogul's work is striking. Observing another mouse in pain actually increased the observer mouse's own pain sensitivity. It was a social effect, only happening between cagemates. Now, were the mice feeling empathy in the human sense? Probably not. But the behavior, resonance with another's distress, is undeniable. Does this lead to prosocial behavior? Yes, remarkably, animals do show prosocial behavior aimed at reducing distress. Reconciliation after fights is common, grooming, affiliative contact to smooth things over. De Waal's work showed third-party consolation in chimps, preferentially comforting the victim, not the aggressor. This requires tracking who did what, and wanting to comfort. Similar behavior is seen in wolves, dogs, elephants, even corvids preening victims. Prairie voles show it too, licking and grooming stressed partners, matching their anxiety levels, driven by oxytocin and ACC. But it goes further. Rats will actively work harder to free a distressed cagemate than to get chocolate. They even share chocolate if offered. This prosociality has an us-them aspect. Rats help strangers if they're genetically similar, but experience can override this. Why do they do it? Probably not conscious golden rule application, nor purely social calculation. Maybe it's compassion, or maybe just self-interest, getting rid of annoying cries. Scratch an altruistic rat and a hypocrite bleeds. How do we develop these capacities in humans? We start with basic sensorimotor contagion in infancy. Then, developing theory of mind is crucial, though not enough on its own. It allows us to understand intentions and beliefs. From there, empathy matures, from resonating with physical pain to emotional pain. We progress from feeling sorry for an individual to feeling for a whole category. Cognitive sophistication grows, distinguishing harm to objects versus people, intentional versus accidental harm, and developing moral indignation. This enables proactive compassion, feeling responsible to act. Perspective taking evolves too, moving from simple feeling for to the more complex feeling as if. Neurobiologically, this developmental arc makes sense. Early empathy linked to basic pain circuits, PA, later involving VMPFC limbic coupling for emotional pain, VMPFC insula amygdala for moral outrage, and VMPFC TPJ for perspective taking. So, what's the brain's central hub for all this empathic activity? It's the anterior cingulate cortex, traditionally known for monitoring internal bodily states, interoception, and detecting conflicts when things don't go as expected. Empathy sits right at this intersection. Unexpected pain like social exclusion in the cyberball game activates the ACC. The ACC cares about the meaning of pain, not just the location. It responds similarly to social or emotional pain as to physical pain. Intriguingly, it's also involved in positive resonance, when someone else's pleasure becomes your pleasure. Consistently, whenever someone else's pain evokes empathy in us, the ACC is active, and the more painful the situation seems, the more it activates. It's also central to the motivation to alleviate that distress. So the ACC, typically seen as self-oriented, is paradoxically key to feeling for others. How does this self-focused ACC become the center of empathy? Oxytocin offers a clue. This hormone promotes bonding and affiliative behaviors like the vole constellation we saw. Remarkably, oxytocin's within the ACC to enable this behavior. Block oxytocin effects in the ACC and voles stop consoling. So, the self-interested ACC becomes the site of empathy, possibly because feeling another's pain helps us learn vicariously. Like her, I wouldn't want that, triggering avoidance. It's empathy leveraging the ACC's core function. Other regions are critical too. The insula and amygdala are deeply intertwined with empathy circuits. Their involvement increases as empathy becomes contextualized. Why is this happening? Whose fault? This links empathy to feelings of disgust, indignation, anger, especially when injustice is perceived. This anger clouds pure empathy, making it harder to help. When does the cognitive side of empathy take center stage? Obviously, when we need to figure out what's going on. But more interestingly, when dealing with causation and intention, why is he in pain? Pesticide or hangovers? Chimps do this when comforting victims. Kids distinguish self-inflicted from other-inflicted pain. Resonating with less overt pain like emotional pain or abstract representations engages more cognitive areas like the DMPFC. Understanding novel pain types requires cognitive effort. Overcoming our natural bias against them is a huge cognitive task. Hospital chaplains actively fight Yavis bias. Stronger in-group bias correlates with stronger ACC responses to in-group pain. Broader us versus them differences predict helping likelihood, and empathizing with them requires greater frontocortical activation to suppress automatic indifference. Socioeconomic bias is stark. Wealthier people tend to be less empathetic, less compassionate, less attuned to others' emotions, and more greedy. Priming wealth increases candy taking. Why? System justification. Greed is good. Meritocracy. Independence. Empathizing with disliked people is cognitively taxing, potentially activating reward pathways for gloating. Empathy fatigue reflects cognitive overload. Even switching perspectives from first person to third person engages frontal regions to regulate self-focus. Cognition clearly does heavy lifting, especially when bridging differences. Now for a detour into one of the biggest stories in neuroscience, mirror neurons. Discovered in the 1990s by Rizzolatti and Gallese in monkeys, they found neurons in the premotor cortex that fired both when the monkey performed an action like grasping food and when it watched someone else perform the same action. About 10% of movement-related neurons did this mirroring. Humans were assumed to have similar neurons, later confirmed. These neurons are quite sophisticated. They respond to sights and sounds of actions, recognize actions even partially hidden, and importantly, respond to the intention behind the action, grasping to drink versus grasping to clear a table. What's their purpose? The most plausible idea is motor learning by observation. Less convincing is their role in understanding intentions or theory of mind, though some connectivity hints exist. They might also help map social interactions. But mirror neurons have been heavily criticized. Scientists like Hickok, Marcus, Churchland, and Pinker argue they've been massively oversold. The main criticisms hit hard. First, causality. Just because mirror neuron activity correlates with attempts to understand others, doesn't mean the neurons cause the understanding. Second, necessity and sufficiency. We clearly understand intentions behind actions we can never perform ourselves, like pole vaulting or explaining relativity. Mirror neurons aren't essential for this higher-level understanding. Third, the autism link. The idea that a broken mirror causes autism has been largely debunked by meta-analyses showing no significant deficits in basic mirror neuron function in autistic individuals. Finally, the sheer scope of speculation linking them to language, consciousness, and especially empathy is seen by many as unfounded hype. And that brings us to the hype cycle surrounding mirror neurons and empathy. The initial discovery sparked excitement, and inevitably, speculation followed. Maybe they even explain empathy. Some studies offered tentative correlations, like stronger mirroring in self-reported empathic individuals. But then came the problematic claims, confusing correlation with causation, declaring mirror neurons a prerequisite for empathy. And then, the outright declarations, Ramachandran calling them Gandhi neurons and claiming they did for psychology what DNA did for biology. Philosophers stating empathy is a biologically evolved capacity shown by mirror neurons. News articles asserting people literally feel what someone else is experiencing. Even a 6-year-old confidently stating it's because our neurons have mirrors. Sadly, most researchers in the field now agree that while intriguing, mirror neurons have not been proven to mediate empathy. The connection remains largely speculative and largely rejected. So wrapping up this section, the story of empathy and deception is complex. Healthy empathic responses clearly involve both affective components, centered around the ACC and related structures, and cognitive components, involving the PFC and 2M networks. It's not a simple either-or, it's a dynamic interplay where the balance shifts depending on the situation. Cognition, particularly the frontal cortex, often has to do the heavy lifting, especially when we need to overcome biases, understand intentions, or empathize with those outside our immediate circle. And while mirror neurons are fascinating, their role in the core mechanisms of empathy remains highly debated and largely unsupported by current evidence. It's a reminder that understanding the brain's role in morality and social behavior is an ongoing, nuanced endeavor.